Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Our speaker this morning is Richard Goldstein. Working in journalism, Richard has lived a double life, so to speak. As a reporter and editor, he was concerned with those whom he now looks back on as having been among the temporarily living. Then he turned to his theme of this morning, the obituary genre, writing about prominent figures who, he is happy to say, has been in no position to complain about his assessment of their lives. Richard worked at the Daily News, Newsday, and the New York Bureau of the United Press International, mostly on their metropolitan desks, and then joined the New York Times in 1980. In his 27 years there, he was an editor in the sports department and also wrote obituaries. Since retiring in 2007, he has contributed obit articles to the paper on a part-time basis. I'd add that we frequently see his stories quite regularly, as I'm sure he will tell you about. He's also written several books concentrating on military and sports history. Richard's America at D-Day was published on the 50th anniversary of the June 6, 1944 Allied invasion of Normandy. He told of the wartime home front in Helluva Town, the story of New York City during World War II. His book, Spartan Seasons, How Baseball Survived the Second World War, recalled how the game persevered despite the loss of numerous players to military service. Having grown up as a fan of a certain ball club, you may recall, he wrote Superstars and Screwballs, 100 Years of Brooklyn Baseball. Richard graduated from Brooklyn College in 1963 and received a master's degree in political science from the University of Michigan in 1984. Richard and I have known each other since our undergraduate years, when we both worked on the Kingsman, the newspaper of Brooklyn College. So with that, Richard, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me, or am I
You're
still
fine.
We hear you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'd like to express thanks to my cats for inviting me to speak today, and to all of you for turning out. Our little dog, which has been sleeping through the last 45 minutes, has finally left the room. But I hope she'll be back in time to hear some of my talk. Concerning my background, apart from what Mike has mentioned, I'll briefly tell you a bit about how I came to write obituary articles. About 20 years ago, when I was an editor with the New York Times sports department, the obituary department editor was seeking to beef up the paper's holdings of advance obits on sports figures. Since I had written a few books on baseball history, I was tapped to write for the obit section, in addition to my continuing to work in the sports department. I've also had an interest in military history, so in time, I started writing obits on recipients of the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor in combat, and others from military ranks. And the third prong is I was eventually, I don't know why, but I was eventually asked to write obits on figures from NASA's space program as well. So I've written about for the Times, about the race with the Soviet Union to put men on the moon, and also America's space shuttle program. So I'd like to turn now essentially to advance obituaries. Mostly I write advances, although at times I do spot obits on people who are prominent enough to be mentioned in the obit, to be accorded an obit, but for one reason or another have just not had an advance written on them. So far as I know, the Times now has at least 1,500 obits on file, some of them having been written many years ago. And once the announcement of a death has been confirmed by the Times, it can be put on the Times website and will later appear in the print editions. After the first edition of the advance has gone online, inserts can be made providing information on cause of death, survivors, and reaction from associates. As I'm sure you know, with the rise of the digital age, speed has become increasingly important in delivering the news. The Times is very attuned to breaking a story online before major competitors. Most importantly, the Washington Post. In fact, the Times puts out an internal report online on what's happened during the previous overnight. In other words, which stories have been developed during the night, and whether we were ahead of the Times by 5 minutes, or we ahead of the Post by 5 minutes, or behind by 5 minutes. Which reminds me actually of the time when I worked at eons ago at United Press International, the wire service, and they were in competition with the Associated Press to get a big story there. And the formal model was deadline every minute, but there was an informal model, which was get it first and get it right later. But hopefully they mostly got things right at any rate. While many people are intrigued by the craft of obituary writing, so far as I could tell, there's a certain amount of squeamishness. I've often asked by acquaintances if I could write an obit on them when the time comes, but they don't seem to be in a hurry to have their names appear on obit headlines. So I usually tell them that they look great and I don't expect them to be one of my victims anytime soon. Now, I'll sprinkle my talk with some obituary jokes that I hope will elicit laughter, or at least a few chuckles, to avoid gloom descending upon this meeting. I'd like to start by citing a cartoon in the New Yorker. The drawing by Paul Noth shows a woman introducing a doddering old man to guests at a cocktail party. She has a hand under his arm in what appears to be an effort to keep him from falling down. She tells the guests at the party, Mr. Stevenson is the subject of a widely anticipated obituary. While I'll speak about various aspects of obituary writing this morning, I do have a specific theme. The changing focus in the Times on who gets an obituary. And that reflects the Times' overall coverage of the news and its recognition of the changing nature of American society. So the Times has increasingly covered issues involving women and people of color. While I've done obits on major sports figures, most recently Hank Aaron, I've written about outstanding American athletes who never got a chance to reach the national sports spotlight because of racial barriers, or were past their athletic primes when the barriers fell. So I'd like to cite a few examples. You may know these names, but probably most of you have never heard of these people and I can understand that certainly. I've written in advance on a fellow named Willie O'Ree, O''R''E', who's 85 years old now. He was the first player in the National Hockey League, appearing with the Boston Bruins in the 1950s. His career was brief, his barrier breaking received little attention at the time, and he was essentially forgotten as the years passed. But he was finally recognized several years ago when he was named by the National Hockey League to head up initiatives to introduce youth hockey leagues to young people of color. Now there's barely a week that goes by when I don't see some article about his activities. I've done obits on figures from baseball's Negro Leagues who never got a chance to play in the majors in the years before Jackie Robinson broke the game's modern color barrier with the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. Citing one example, I profile Buck O'Neill, who had a long career as a highly prominent figure in the Negro Leagues as a first baseman and manager, and became the Major League's first Black coach with the Chicago Cubs. He wasn't inducted into the Hall of Fame, but his bust stands at the entrance to its hall. I've done an advance obit on Rachel Robinson, Jackie's wife, who is 97 years old. It tells how she has carried forth her husband's legacy at many commemorative events sponsored by Major League Baseball. And I also wrote about her own professional accomplishments. She earned a doctorate in psychiatric nursing and had been a professor at Yale. To cite another example of an unsung individual of color, in basketball, I wrote an obit on a man named Wat Saka, that's spelled W-A-T, Misaka, who was of Japanese ancestry and was the first National Basketball Association player of color when he played for the Knicks in 1947, after starring at the University of Utah. Like Willie O'Ree in hockey, Misaka, who died in 2019 at 96, did not reach much media attention when he debuted in the pros, but he had been profiled in news articles in his later years. Among women who have broken barriers, I completed an advance obit on Valentina Tereshkova, the Russian who was the first woman to fly in space, orbiting Earth in 1963. But I did note that while her space flight received a great deal of attention, it wasn't entirely a triumph for women. Her flight was essentially a propaganda ploy by the Soviet Union, supposedly to show how socially progressive it was at a time when no American woman had gone into space. No Russian woman has flown in space since Tereshkova did it, but I should note she remains active in Russian political life as a member of Putin's United Russia Party and holds a seat in the Russian parliament. No American woman flew in the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo projects during the race with the Soviet Union to carry out the first manned space flight to the moon. But of course, many women have flown for NASA on shuttle missions. And I would recommend to you, by the way, something I saw on Netflix the other night. It's called the Mercury 13. These are 13 women who wanted to become astronauts. So now we're talking about around 1960 when the program was first developed. And NASA grudgingly allowed her to take various tests. And it turned out she performed even better than the males who were competing to become astronauts, but none of them were ever selected for astronauts. One or two of them is still alive, and it's a really fascinating story that she tells. Along these lines about how the Times has, over the past years, has not accorded space that it should have to women and to Black people. You may have noticed Times has a section on the obit pages headline Overlooked. It provides obits for people who died long ago and who should have received an obit in the Times, but never did. When the Times introduced the Overlooked section in 2018, it noted that the vast majority of obits going back decades were on men, most of them white. And in the 2 years prior to 2018, only 20% of the subjects in Times obituaries were women. Among the women who had never received a Times obit were, I'm sure you know these names, the photographer Diane Arbus, the poet Sylvia Plath, and Ida B. Wells, who took on racism in the Deep South with powerful reporting on lynching. You may remember how many years ago newspapers had women's sections covering parenting, fashion, and items generally pertaining to the home. Women seeking jobs as reporters and editors used to be largely confined to working for these sections, if they were hired at all. So there hadn't been much of a woman's perspective in choosing subjects for obits. Additionally, comparatively few women had received public recognition in decades past, since they weren't allowed to compete with men for significant positions. I've written one belated obit for the Overlooked section on a Black man named Moses Fleetwood Walker. Talk about people disappearing from history. Jackie Robinson has invariably been cited as the first Black player in Major League history. That's not true. Robinson was the first African-American in modern Major League history, which is considered to have begun in 1901, when the game embarked on the current two-league structure, the American League and the National League. Moses Fleet Walker played with the Toledo team of the Old American Association in 1883, when it was part of the major leagues, together with the National League, which had been founded in 1876. But my piece on Walker was not a feel-good article. He led a very frustrating life after that 1 year in baseball. Walker was barred from the majors after that one season of 1883. He was one of the many victims of the backlash against Reconstruction after the Civil War, which was providing former slaves with true rights of citizenship. Walker, who grew up in Ohio, a dark-skinned son of mixed race, was a son of a doctor and attended Oberlin College and the University of Michigan. But he lost hope that Black people would, after he'd been being barred by baseball, never being able to come back, he lost hope that Black people would ever be accepted by whites in his lifetime. In 1908, he published a scholarly treatise in which he supported the Back to Africa movement, which called upon American Blacks to emigrate to the ancestral homeland. Now, Moses Fleetwood Walker is a name that I never heard of him, and I doubt anybody reading Times Obits had ever heard of him, but he was a story that was told 120 years after his passing. I'd like to turn now to some others who were briefly enmeshed in an historic event. Two of them in connection with the assassination of President Kennedy, and three others for their heroism in World War II. I've written an advance obit on Clint Hill, who's now 89 years old. Clint Hill was the only Secret Service agent to be given a Medal for Valor in the wake of the JFK Association. But I imagine he's barely remembered today. So I really enjoy writing about people who I think who readers would say, oh, I didn't know about him. And also they learn a little bit more about aspects of history they might not have been aware of. So I just wanted to mention a few details on Clint Hill. His quick response to rifle shots fired by Lee Harvey Oswald was credited with saving Jackie Kennedy's life. Hill, who was only 31 years old at the time, was riding on a running board on the car right behind Kennedy's open-top limo, which carried two Secret Service agents in the front seat as it wound through downtown Dallas. At the sound of what some of the entourage believed were backfires from motorcycles, Hill recognized the sound of gunfire. Mrs. Kennedy had scrambled onto the trunk of the Kennedy limo while it was still in motion. Hill jumping onto the trunk was captured in an often published still photograph. He pushed Mrs. Kennedy back into the rear seat of the limo and sprawled atop her and President Kennedy as the limo sped to Parkland Hospital, where Kennedy was pronounced dead. Testimony before the Warren Commission stated Mrs. Kennedy would almost certainly have fallen into the street and been run over by the cars behind the presidential level, if not for Hill's quick action. Now, there's a second part to this story, and I thought it would be important to tell that as well. Hill was promoted to the head of the White House Secret Service detail under Lyndon Johnson, but he lived a troubled life for many years, believing that if he had jumped onto the presidential limousine a fraction of a second before he did, he, rather than Kennedy, might have taken Oswald's third shot, which is considered to have been the fatal one. Hill said later that he would have gladly given his life to save JFK. Feelings of guilt overwhelmed him, and he fell into a deep depression and became an alcoholic, then retired from the Secret Service upon the advice of physicians. He eventually gave up drinking and joined with a professional author named Lisa McKibben in writing several books about the assassination and his overall experiences with the Secret Service. Another iconic image from the Kennedy assassination is the Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph showing Oswald grimacing in the split second when he was shot in the stomach by Jack Ruby while being escorted by the Dallas police to his arraignment for assassinating Kennedy. The photo of Oswald was taken by a man named Robert Jackson of the Dallas Times-Herald, who was among the many photographers lined up in the hallway as Oswald was being removed from the Dallas police station. Jackson was lucky enough to have snapped the shutter at the precise second when Oswald was hit. He later faded into obscurity, but I thought it would be really fascinating to do an advance obit on him. And he's now 87 years old. At times, being the last survivor of an historic episode can be the angle for an obituary and an opportunity to reprise a chunk of history. So I'd like to turn now to military campaigns. 423 medals of honor were awarded for valor in World War II, many of them posthumously. Herschel Williams of West Virginia, a former Marine, was decorated with the medal for wiping out Japanese soldiers firing from caves in the invasion of Iwo Jima, a storied chapter in the history of the Marine Corps. Williams carried a flamethrower that he would aim at the entrance to the caves, resulting in the gruesome deaths of the Japanese inside. His job was the most perilous of the invasion. On one foray, in fact, several Marine riflemen providing cover for Williams were killed. But Williams wasn't hit by Japanese fire, and he wasn't wounded then nor at any other time in World War II combat. He celebrated his 98th birthday last week, lives in West Virginia, and is the last living Medal of Honor recipient from World War II. When I spoke with him in connection with writing his advance obit, he told me how he found religion after the war, having asked himself throughout his later life, why me? Why did God spare him so he not only survived the war, but lived to so long an age? And Williams has created a foundation to provide college scholarships to children whose fathers or mothers lost their lives in war during the past 80 years. And he still travels around the country to promote it, the foundation. So it's likely when Williams dies, his body will lie in state in the rotunda of the Capitol as a symbol of America's death to all the servicemen and women who died in World War II. So I wanted to be sure that we had a generous obit in the Times, when the moment comes. I'd like to mention two others for whom I've written advances who presumably would have lived out their lives in relative anonymity, if not for their exploits in war and their living to a glorious old age. John Hemingway, an Irishman who's now 102 years old, is the last still living pilot among the nearly 3,000 crewmen who flew in the Battle of Britain in 1940, when the Royal Air Force beat back Germany's Air Force, which was carrying out bombing raids as part of Hitler's attempt to gain air supremacy over Britain as a prelude to a Nazi ground invasion of the British Isles. The RAF's odds-defying triumph in the air occasioned Churchill's statement before Parliament in August 1940. Never in the history of armed conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few. Flying Hurricane and Spitfire fighters, Hemingway received the commendation for shooting down German planes and was shot down 4 times during the war, once over France, twice over Britain, and then over Italy. So not only is he the last of the few, in Churchill's words, but he had an especially eventful war. Another military figure for whom I've done an advance is George Johnson, better known as Johnny Johnson, now 99 years old, who is the last survivor of the Royal Air Force's World War II bombing raid that destroyed 2 bridges and damaged a 3rd in a successful mission to flood Germany's Ruhr Valley, its industrial heartland. The mission was codenamed Operation Chastise, but the British crewmen who carried it out amid heavy casualties came to be known as Dam Busters. The raid boosted the morale of the British home front, but it resulted in the deaths of numerous civilians in German slave labor camps in the Ruhr area. And the Germans eventually rebuilt the dam. In fact, there's still a controversy in the United Kingdom over the morality and effectiveness of that raid. But that doesn't take away anything from the courage of these dam busters. And I'm sure that when Mr. Hemingway of the Battle of Britain and Mr. Johnson of the dam busters die, there will be enormous media coverage in Britain. And the Times, being an international paper, would want to weigh in on that as well. In selecting candidates for an advance obit, I seldom do anybody under the age of 80, unless he is or she is known to be in poor health. I'm not rooting for anybody to die, just being realistic. And I should say the notorious as well as the valorous get their due in Times obits. To give an especially egregious example, I wrote an obit on Edgar Ray Killen, who is the mastermind of the Mississippi Ku Klux Klan plot, in which 3 young men working on behalf of voting rights for Black people were ambushed one night on a country road, pulled from their car and murdered. You'll recall their names, Andrew Goodwin, Mickey Schwimmer, and James Chaney. The killings were remembered especially for the movie Mississippi Burning. So I had an advance ready to go on Killen when he died in the Mississippi State Penitentiary. Not that I'm comparing her to Edgar Ray Killen, but I'd like to mention an obit I wrote on Marge Schott, was of German-American background and was the owner of the Cincinnati Reds in the 1980s. She stirred outrage in 1992 when she said early in her tenure, Hitler was good in the beginning. She apologized, but was suspended by baseball. And she was later came back and but was criticized for some other episode. When an umpire named John McSherry collapsed and died at home plate of a heart attack in 1996, during the home opener for the Reds, causing the game to be called off, she bemoaned having lost significant gate receipts. Responding to the outrage concerning her callousness, she sent a bouquet to McSherry's family, but it turned out the flowers were recycled. She had received them from someone and didn't buy a new bunch of flowers to show her respects. So when I wrote her obit, I tried hard to find something good to say, since I figured she couldn't be all bad. So I discovered that she loved animals and had made major contributions to the Cincinnati Zoo. But there were, however, complications. She allowed her sizable collection of St. Bernards, including one named Shotzi, to roam on the Cincinnati ballpark's outfield grass during batting practice. And they left behind what I'll call presents for the outfielders who were none too happy to step on them. To my great surprise, I received a letter from a sports writer for a small paper in Ohio complaining that I was unfair to Marge for what he saw as simply dwelling on the negative, despite my heroic efforts to find something kind to say. In a little bit on something involving researching a person for an obituary, I'll check articles on the individual from the Times and other publications, transcripts online from oral history interviews they may have given, as well as interviews shown on YouTube, if there's time in the case of an advance obit. And I would also look at memoirs or biographies. I may try to reach the individual for whom I'm writing in advance, but generally there's so much material out there and in the person's own words that I don't do this all too often. But I will always seek to locate a family member to get information on the survivors and aspects of that person's early life that might not have been readily available. Seeking a quote from someone, let's say a teammate from the deceased, the ball club, also can enhance an obit. On another obit matter, I'd like to say something about how the Times verifies that people who reportedly have died are in fact deceased. There are various ways in which the Times learns of a death meriting an obit. Sometimes a person stating that he or she is a family member of the deceased will contact the paper, usually by email. But the Times needs to verify that the contact is legitimate. There is a website that lists phone numbers for individuals throughout the country, so long as you can enter the name and the city where that person lives and the phone number is not unlisted. So that way you can find a family member to call who you know is legitimately a family member. Contacting a funeral home that has posted a family written obituary on its website is another good source for verification. Now, sometimes the Times learns of a death by checking Wikipedia's daily listing of evidently prominent people from around the world who have just died. Wikipedia picks up obits from newspapers and broadcast outlets. In fact, if you're interested, you can access this by Googling deaths and 2021. In fact, there used to be a game called Dead or Alive that people played, where they would list people they thought would die in the coming year. Like the Queen Mother, who was 103, was always on that list. Ronald Reagan, Queen Elizabeth, when she's probably only 92. And I think it was basically played for fun. I don't think there was any betting on it, which I guess would be illegal. But getting back to the Times verification of a death before printing anything, nothing is foolproof. In 1980, the Times ran an obit on a fellow named Alan Abel, who did devote his life to hoaxing the news media. An item sent to the Times stated that Abel had died in a skiing accident. Now, the Times knew of Abel's background as a trickster and went to great lengths to verify that the submission was genuine. It spoke to about a dozen people who had provided different strands of information about Abel's supposed death. The 1980 obit that appeared in the Times read, I'll just read the first two paragraphs to you. The headline is Alan Abel, satirist, created campaign to clothe animals. Alan Abel, a writer, musician, and film producer who specialized in satire and lampoons, died of a heart attack yesterday at Sundance, a ski resort near Orem, Utah, while investigating a location for a new film. He was 50 years old and lived in Manhattan and Westport, Connecticut. Mr. Abel, a graduate of Ohio State University with majors in music and speech, made a point in his work of challenging the obvious and uttering the outrageous. He gained national recognition several years ago when he mounted a campaign for animal decency, demanding that horses and dogs, for example, be fitted with underwear. So the Times, a light bulb could have gone off saying, Jesus, maybe he's hoaxing us. But they really went to great lengths to find plausible people to confirm his death. Well, lo and behold, a day later, Alan Abel surfaced, disclosing that he was alive and well. The Times ran a box saying obituary disclosed as hoax. An obituary in the New York Times Wednesday reported incorrectly that Alan Abel was dead. Mr. Abel held a news conference yesterday to announce the obituary was a result of a hoax he arranged to gain publicity. He described himself as a professional hoaxer and said that about 9 accomplices had been involved in the deception. Now, this was 1980. Now we move ahead to 2018, when Abel actually did die. So the Times' Marguerite Fox, a wonderful writer, wrote an obituary reprising, second obituary on him that had appeared in the Times, reprising his many hoaxes and explaining how he conned the Times. And I'll cite the first two paragraphs from her piece. Mr. Abel's, now again, this is 2018. Mr. Abel's putative 1980 death, orchestrated with his characteristic military precision and inviting a dozen accomplices, had been confirmed to the Times by several rigorously rehearsed Confederates. One masqueraded as the grieving widow. Another posed as an undertaker, answering fact-checking calls from the newspaper on a dedicated phone line that Mr. Abel had installed, complete with its own directory information business listing. After that, this is again Ms. Fox continuing with the actual. After the obituary was published, meaning 1980, Mr. Abel, symbolically rising from the grave, held a gleeful news conference, and a much abashed Times ran a retraction. Now, I'd like to say a few words about death notices that appear in the newspaper in small type and are handled by the advertising program, the advertising department. They invariably refer to the deceased as beloved, cherished, and so on, and are essentially mini obituaries in which no wrong can be found. There are some who conflate the Times paid death notices with obituary articles. In fact, on a few occasions when I mention I write obits for the Times, I've encountered the response, "Oh, you mean those items with the tiny type?" That was a response I once got when I visited my eye doctor, who I figured was educated enough to distinguish a news article from a family-placed death notice. Now, the death notice is charged by the line. There's a joke that goes by this, like this. Mrs. Smith has submitted a death notice for her husband that read simply, "John Smith dead." The ad department, which has to contact those who submit death notices to avert being victimized by hoaxers, calls Mrs. Smith and says, "You know, we charge by the line. There's still room left on your one-line submission for a few more words." Mrs. Smith replies, "Okay, make it John Smith dies, Buick for sale." Now, if you can bear with me for another and final joke on eulogies, there's a funeral for a guy who was a terrible person. Nobody had a good word for him. And yet, out of respects for the family, there was a turnout at his services. But nobody wanted to deliver a eulogy. Finally, one guy was prevailed upon. He said simply, his brother was worse. And that's it, folks. If you'd like to ask some questions, I would be happy to do my best to answer them.
That's great. Thanks, Rich. So it's the usual protocol. Click your reactions button and then raise your virtual hand. And Mike Martin, you're first. You have to unmute, Mike.
Hang on. Rich, great presentation. I've read some books on obituaries, so I'm quite fascinated with them. But let me get to something more topical. How does the Times guard against political bias, either in the selection or length of essentially obituary, depending upon political views or whatever? And the other issue is Ruth Bader Ginsburg received a lot of obit length. I read that, and I'm just curious how Sandra Day O'Connor will be treated relative to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Is there an internal metric that essentially says, you know, one of equal length, or how does that work? Thank you.
Well, all stories that appear in the Times are double edited. Part of that is looking for errors in style, see whether the lead may be buried, or spelling errors. And then there's another one person who reads it for looking for whatever may be left out, and also weighing in on this. So, the only thing I could say about that is obituary articles, like all articles in the paper, are read carefully by the editors. And if it's seems that there's a political bias, the writer will be contacted and asked about that, and they try and work things out to eliminate what seems to be a political bias. In terms of Sandra Day O'Connor, I really can't address that because I really can't speculate on that aspect of things.
Okay,
I partially answered your question, I guess.
okay.
Thank you. Richard Smith.
Very good presentation, Rich. It was fascinating. Just a kind of a double question. First, are the advanced obits revised on a periodic basis, just so you don't have to, do extra work at the time of a person's passing? And then secondly, you'd mentioned you wouldn't write an advance obit for someone, until they've reached 80, but is that the Times policy? Because just as an example, I would think someone like, Bob Dylan probably has an advance obit on file because it'd probably be a very lengthy, obit, to be readily available when he passes, at some point.
What was the first question again? Sorry.
First question was, are the advanced obits revised on a periodic basis?
Yeah, in fact, I had listed that in my text, and I think somehow I had neglected to mention that. Yes, they definitely are supposed to be done, and I really make an effort to keep. I have about 180 pieces that I've done with people who are still alive, and it's a lot to keep track of. But I do my best to note individuals. I go back through the pieces I've written from time to time, and to see whether the people that I wrote the advances for have been involved in something in later life. Most of them are retired, but in some cases there's a need to do that. Or sometimes in going over an older piece, I see things that I should have realized should have included, but did not. So I try to make it so that when a person dies, it's in the best shape possible. When you're doing I do some spot obits also. The people who are prominent, but for one reason or another have not had advances done on them. So that's a little bit more of a scramble. You don't have as much time as you would, of course, with the advances. Yeah, with the ones who I have done pieces on many years ago, I do really try my best to update them.
Thank you.
Quick follow-up on that, Rich. How large is the staff? And do people do this full time, or are they like you, they're borrowed from other departments and do this as a sideline at the times?
Okay, I can't give you an exact answer on this, but I can approximate it. The Times has an obituaries editor who is in charge of the obituaries department. There are several people who write exclusively for the obituary pages, so they're kind of generalists. And there are also several editors who are who are working specifically for the obits department. So they edit the copy that the reporters on the obits desk have done. And the obits overall editor for the department reads everything as well. My guess, this is only a guess, I would say there might be about maybe a dozen people or so working explicitly for the obits department. Now, the department will also call, there are people who, like me, who are retired and who contribute articles, but they also will call on active reporters who have a certain specialty to do an obit. Like, let's say, for example, astronomy. The Times Science Department has a few writers who concentrate on astronomy And a lot, that stuff is so difficult and so complicated to explain the significance of astronomical contributions, that they're the best people to do it. And the same thing also sometimes somebody who writes for the business section might do a piece on a businessman or somebody from the culture section, on an artist. So there's a really vast, I mean, at times, I can't give you an exact number, but I think it has well over 1,300 editors and reporters. So there's really a vast pool to pick from in terms of getting somebody to write a piece.
Steve Varley.
Thank you, Rich, for a great talk. Now, out of curiosity, is your own obituary on file at the New York Times? And if so, were you allowed to participate in its writing?
Actually, I knew somebody would ask me that. And I actually wrote my own obit, which I've given to my wife for safekeeping. I'm sorry, what was the other part of the question?
No, I think you've answered it. Were you allowed to participate in its writing? And apparently you wrote it.
No, I didn't say that I had written one for myself, because eventually my wife, well, I hope I will predecease my wife, will give it to the paper, and then they'll take it from there and do what they want. Either not use it, they might use it, or rewrite it. It's beyond me to determine.
Thank
So
you.
basically, it's treated like anybody else. They might do an one. I mean, who has worked for the paper. Matter of fact, this is might be of some interest to you. At times, you can get a byline for even after you're dead. Once in a while, you will see an obituary article, and on the bottom it'll say that was written as an advance. At the bottom, it will say, Joe Smith, who wrote this obituary, was formerly a member of the Times sports department or politics department, and died in such and such a year. So they're very generous with bylines, whether you're alive or not.
Nolan Ash. Unmute.
Okay, two things. I don't know if it was Clint Hill, but someone died recently. It was on national television, and he was with the Secret Service protection team for JFK on the day he was assassinated. And he said he felt responsible for the death of JFK because it was raining in Fort Worth. And when they landed in Dallas on the plane, it was sunny. And supposedly he's the guy who said it was safe to take the top off the car. Now, I don't know if that was Clint Hill or somebody else. And I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but I did watch that on national television, and I'm constantly trying to deal with JFK conspiracy nuts. But I don't know if you want to add or modify anything about that.
Well, Clint Hill has often been interviewed to talk about his actions and the guilt he felt afterwards. I read a lot about the assassination because apart from doing this obit, I'm really fascinated with it.
Okay.
And there was a book recently written by two Washington Post reporters you might be interested in reading on the history of the Secret Service, which goes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I know it. Was he the guy? My question is, was he the guy who authorized taking the roof off the car?
Although I will not be able to answer that question really. My understanding is that the Secret Service hated the roof being up, but Kennedy insisted on it because he said that people want to see me. And and Dallas, of course, was notorious for being a right-wing hub at the time, but he wanted it up. Now, the reference to the rain, I don't recall coming across that. It sounds like it could have been Hill because he's filled with guilt over it. But I do know that Kennedy wanted the tops up all the time, and I don't know for sure whether Hill has ever been quoted as saying he wanted it down that day. It was overruled.
Well, the obvious weather was it was raining like hell in Fort Worth. They flew to Dallas. They got to Dallas. It was sunny, and it was an omen. To lighten it up a lot, and for all our classic rock friends and fans in the audience, I want to commend you greatly for a large obituary, a quarter of a page, on Jack Bruce. Jack Bruce was musically trained in Glasgow. He was a musical genius. He became a jazz musician, and he's not the most famous classic rock superstar, but he's one of them. Jack Bruce joined up with a guy called Ginger Baker and a guy called Eric Clapton. And of course, they were the supergroup Cream, considered one of the greatest of all time. Thank you, New York Times. I'm done.
Actually, I'd be glad to take credit, but I didn't write that one.
Okay.
Okay, Mitch,
I'm a classical music is not my. Is not. I played the saxophone in high school badly, and I played in a army band in the National Guard. But I don't write about the music world. We have plenty of writers who are really good at that.
Yeah,
Mitch Erickson, you're next.
Referring to.
Mitch.
Yeah. Hi, Rich. You mentioned writing your own obituary. The old guard were about 300 members, and we're all old. And some of us older than others. There's a couple that are over 100. Anyway, what's your advice, A, to us individually on preparing your own obituary, and B, would it be something where we would get together and kind of edit each other's obituary?
Well, I mean, if somebody wants to submit an obituary to the Times and ask their friends to look it over, that's fine. But you know, I'll tell you this, and I just learned a little bit more the other day because somebody did a piece about how Alex Traub was his name, and it was on page 2. Page 2 often has articles by Times people giving a little inside view of the paper. And he said that somebody in the obit department, there's someone who, or various people, who look at everything that is submitted there, because you never could tell when there's a story there that you don't know about. So if a proposed obit is submitted to the paper, I think you can have confidence that it's read. And then they get hordes of them, really. I don't know how many, but many submitted. And then it's a matter of going over them and having discussions as who might be a potential candidate for an obit that they didn't know about. And then they take it from there.
I apologize. I didn't phrase that exactly right. I was not thinking specifically of submitting to the Times, but just having something like you have with stashed with your wife, but just something that you would write in advance on yourself, regardless of whether it's in the Times or in a professional journal or the local paper, whatever. So that was, I mean, do you feel it's a good exercise to do and a service to your family if you write your own obituary before the family has to figure out how to scramble and do it the day after you die?
Yeah, well, I think it's nice to do a memoir, and it's something you can have for the family. I mean, I know some people who wrote entire books that were self-published about their lives, and it's even if it's not publicly, on sale, it's something for children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren to have. I think
So, Mitch, there's a project for the Reminiscences group. Rich, just so you know, Mitch started a group.
remember to include the bad things as well as the good ones.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Mitch's group already does reminiscences like that, but maybe you should take on a project of preparing short, full bios that could be used as
I charge by the word, so it's lengthy.
Okay, so Dave DeLong.
Yes, Rich, thank you for the wonderful presentation. I noticed that years ago, the publications would include a cause of death, but now so many publications are reluctant to do that. Do you know any of the reasons?
I don't know about other publication, but the Times definitely would like to know cause of death. That's why we always make an effort to reach family member to get that. If it's not already available on an authoritative source. Like one place to look for certain details if you can't reach the family is funeral home websites, because a lot of funeral homes will publish family written obituaries on their websites. So it gives you the nitty gritty in terms of survivors. What was I going to say?
Well, I
Um,
was, my focus was on all the
Oh, of course.
newspapers that refused to include that.
Yeah,
You
they
know,
try and get cause of death. It's less needed in people who are, say, 95, 96, and they were in a nursing home. Got to figure the cause of death was natural, that it was natural causes. But we do make every effort to get cause of deaths. If I can't get it some other way, I'll call a funeral home and ask them that. But funeral homes are very reluctant to give that out without the permission of the family. They regard it as sensitive, potentially sensitive information. It's not public business unless the family wants to release it. But sometimes I can get it from a funeral home.
Alejo.
Great talk. Quick question. Has a Times obit ever won a journalism award or a literary award?
I don't know. I mean, it's not a category for Pulitzers. I don't know about any other awards. Not that I'm aware of, which is not to say that there hasn't been any. The Times, by the way, has a very thick book called The Book of the Dead, which was edited by Bill McDonald, the obits editor, which prints obituaries that have appeared in the Times going all the way back to the 19th century. If you're a big obituary fan.
Thank you.
So let me just say it's 11:33. Mike Katz has his hand up, but he gets the last word anyway. So I'm going to bump up the one other person with a hand raised, and that is somebody who's called in from his car. You can see him there in his tile, and he's only showing up as iPhone. So please say your name and ask your question.
Yeah, this is Don Goldberg. It's more of a comment that there are additional benefits to having an obituary other than the purely informational. Prior to retiring, I was the insurance specialist in my financial planning company. We had a client who was a business owner who had a secretary whose services, shall we say, extended beyond the purely secretarial. And he had some concern that after he passed on that she might not be adequately cared for, but didn't want to leave her anything from his will because, he didn't want his wife and kids to know. So we talked about it and came upon setting up a $500,000 life insurance policy where she would be the beneficiary and also the owner of the policy, and he would pay the premium. So it worked well during his lifetime, but after he died, I got a rather frantic phone call from her saying that she tried to file a claim with the insurance company and they want a death certificate and not a photocopy, an original. She said, how am I going to do that? I can't very well call up his wife and ask for one. She's suspicious as it is. So I said, he lived in New Jersey. I said, just look in the Star Ledger, Newark Star Ledger. There's an obituary, cut it out, mail it in with the beneficiary claim form, and I'll make sure it gets honored, which is what happened. They relied on the accuracy of the obituary to pay out $500,000 to her.
Mm. I hope the obit wasn't a hoax.
Okay, well, if you're okay staying a couple more minutes, Rich, before we give it to Mike, Bill Tittle has raised his hand. So go ahead, Bill, ask a question. Oh, except I have to ask you to unmute. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much. A lovely presentation.
Thank you.
So my question is, let's say someone's unsung and you call people up and one guy says, this person's just the greatest person. And then you call the next guy up and says, he's a self-centered son of a bitch. How do you deal with that? And do you deal with it? I mean, most obits are very kind to people. You just leave the bad stuff out.
Well, I don't do that. I don't think the Times does that either. You just have to sift through, oh, my dog made an entrance. You didn't want to hear it talk, just want to hear the question. No, that's part of a person's life, the good and the bad. And I touched on that a bit with one shot piece.
Okay, thanks. Just wondered.
Just have to, you have to try and be fair. And it's not as I say, not a death notice. It's not a eulogy.
I did wonder whether writing your own obituary is somewhat problematical because you can be self-delusional about who you really are.
Well, mine was pretty straightforward. I didn't go into my psyche. It's not going to be 1,000 words. It's not going to be 800 words. Just the facts, man, as Jack Webb used to say, just the facts. She's back.
Yeah, she's cute.
Great.
So Mike, you get the last question, but you also get to do the closing ceremony. So it's all yours.
Rich, thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation.
Well, pleasure joining you.
Obviously, everybody really enjoyed it and got something out of it about how this whole process works. This is a little bit off topic, but let me ask you about it anyway. This was an article that appeared in Sunday's Times.
No.
Did you happen to see this?
Well, you grew up in Brooklyn, so I guess you were.
I did. And I don't know how clearly this came out, but this was an article.
Oh, I read it.
It's the fact that October 3rd, last Sunday, was the 70th anniversary of the shot heard around the world, Bobby Thompson's home run in playoffs in 1951 between the Dodgers and the Giants. And I guess my question to you is also being a Brooklynite. Many of us remember where we were, say, at the time of the Kennedy assassination, which was discussed earlier, and 9/11 and so forth. Do you remember where you were on October 3rd, 1951?
I do. I was on my way to Hebrew school, after regular public school. And I really dislike going to Hebrew school, but my parents said, go until you're bar mitzvah and then you can quit, which is what I did. So on the way to Hebrew school, I stopped at a candy store that had the ball game on, and I saw Thompson hit the home run. And then I trudged on to Hebrew school. And I always associated the two, so I hated Hebrew school even more. I did obits, by the way, on Ralph Frank and Bobby Thompson. And they became friends over the years.
Was it Bobby Thompson that lived in Watchung, which is very near here?
I'm sorry, what?
I think Bobby Thompson lived in Watchung, New Jersey, which is very close to Summit.
He was a salesman after his baseball years. And Ralph Franker, I think, worked in insurance. And they did a kind of a dog and pony act. They would appear together to talk about the event. But Ralph, I'm getting a little bit off topic here now, but a book came out not too long ago revealing that the Giants had a system with cheating, and that they had a system.
Yeah.
They had a spy. The clubhouse in the Polo Grounds was behind center field, and they used a telescope to figure out the signs the catchers were giving. And then they had a buzzer to the bullpen and telling them what the fastball or a curve, and that would be relayed to the batter, who would look to the bullpen for the buzzer. It was a rather complicated thing. And Thompson has always been cagey about that, about whether he knew what was coming on the pitch that he hit for the home run, which was a fastball. And he said, well, yeah, there was such a thing, but on that at bat, I did not know what it was coming, which who knows if that's true or not. But they were both very fine people.
I'll just add that.
And how did you like Hebrew school, Mike?
My attitude was the same as yours. And I might add that I was in the schoolyard at the time Thompson hit the home run of the public school that I went to. One of the kids had a portable radio, And we had the game on, and we heard that, and it was just, everybody's just in disbelief, you know.
Yeah.
And it's one of the, I guess, great landmarks of baseball history, but not a happy one if you were a Brooklynite. Anyway, thank you again, Rich, and we do two things to thank our speakers. Let's everybody give Rich a round of applause.
Thanks, Rich.
And
Thank you.
and we also provide a certificate of appreciation, which was up on the screen a minute ago. Can somebody put it up again? There we go. And there's a picture there of an orchid, which reflects the fact that Summit was a center of production of orchids back in the day. So that was part of the old guard tradition. So thank you again, Rich.